that would be fantastic. We are due to have quite a few more people joining us, so I may just stop at a couple of points to welcome them in, but I am going to get going because I've got quite a lot to say today. So what I'm going to be doing is talking you through an article that I've just written for Teaching History. It's based on a project that I carried out with the history department at my school, and basically the project involved a group of Year 8 students being taken off timetable for a day to reflect on the ways in which they were exposed to a diverse past across their history curriculum. And then this was followed by a departmental curriculum review and rewrite. So for the purposes of today's session, I'm going to be talking about the different rationales for and ways of teaching a diverse past, which is clearly something that we are all thinking about at the moment, given what's been going on in the news. Just excuse me whilst I admit a couple more people. Sorry about this. So if you just joined us, welcome. This session is being recorded, so if you have missed anything, don't worry about it. You'll get the chance to return to the recording. Okay, so yeah, so for the purposes of today's session, I'm essentially going to be talking through, sorry, a few more people to admit. Brilliant. Right. Yeah, I'll be talking through the different rationales for and ways of teaching a diverse past. And I'll be drawing on scholarship and teacher practice as I do this. And then I'll also talk about the impetus for our own department's curriculum reform, and then talk about the project itself. I'll finish by touching on how our department have since changed our history curriculum, but I am conscious that I've got a lot to say. So I've written up in detail the bits that we've, or the things that we've done to change our curriculum, and I may well have to just send that out to you after the session. After the session, you'll get the recording and you'll get a PDF of all of the slides. So if you do have any questions, and if you've just joined, please post those throughout in the chat box, but I'm willing to answer anything else after the session. So Erin had a go at guessing where what you can see on the top left hand side of the screen is located, and she was absolutely correct that it is in Timbuktu. The image we started by looking at is the Djingaraba Mosque, which was constructed in 1327 under the instruction of Musa I of Mali, and he ruled the Mali Empire in the 14th century. Some estimates regard him as the richest person of all time, and his wealth he amassed from his country's access to and trade of salt and gold, and he ploughed profits of trade of these commodities into patronage of the arts and religious buildings such as this mosque. So the story of Djingaraba reveals much about the history and wider significance of Timbuktu and Western Africa in general. But despite its historical significance, in my experience in England, this mosque is not widely known. I'll talk in more detail later on about why, for the purposes of our project with Year 8, we chose to focus on African civilizations. But for many reasons, this presented itself as the ideal topic to get students to reflect on diversity within the Key Stage 3 curriculum. So, moving on to the thinking that went into our project prior to the project actually taking place. I'm going to start by talking through academic and practitioner scholarship with regards to why you may want to study a diverse past, and then consider methods for doing so in the classroom. So the first rationale that I'll be starting with is to be considering why the fact that students need to be able to see themselves in the curriculum. As we go through the sessions, you can the slides rather, you can see in the bottom right-hand side, right-hand corner, that there are references to anything that I am mentioning in terms of scholarship, and those references will all be included for you at the end. So Joan, who is a student of African Caribbean descent, made the comment you're about to see when she was being interviewed as part of K-Trail's research into the African Caribbean experience of school history curricula in this country. I'll just give you a couple of seconds to read this quote. So Trail's work urged teachers to consider the implications of doing diversity only through the lens of slavery, and she pointed out that this does little to highlight a shared past and even has the effect of attributing an inferior status to African Caribbean peoples, which is summed up by this second quote from Trail here. Drawing on this research, Trail really argued for the curriculum to hold personal significance to students. They had to be able to interact with the curriculum if they were going to kind of make meaning of it and to have a positive reaction with it. I do apologise that I keep breaking. I'm just admitting more people into the room. This research was published in 2007, but this problem was spotlighted again in 2018 when the Royal Historical Society presented evidence that a lack of diversity in school and university curricula has resulted in fewer BME students choosing to engage in a non-compulsory study of history. So for many BME students, their study of history stops at the end of Key Stage 3, which is an issue that I'm sure we're all considering at the moment how to address. Whitburn and Yamo were working with a similar premise when they built a unit that focused on struggles for civil rights in Britain post-45, a topic that they noted has often been neglected in school history curricula at the expense of civil rights in the US, but it's a topic that definitely does deserve our attention. And Whitburn and Yamo, sorry, I'm just admitting somebody else. I may stop admitting now and then just carry on talking and then send the recording out later on. So they researched students' reactions to studying the post-45 incorporation of people from all over the empire into Britain. And they found new high levels of student engagement. And one student within their research actually commented how he was able to learn how he became himself, which I think is a pretty powerful quote. And then after this, Mohammed and Whitburn also called for history teachers to incorporate narratives that encouraged positive views of Africa's past, rather than narrowing the teaching of Black history to focus solely on racial conflicts or the triumphs of Black civil rights movements. Unfortunately, it could well be the case that a student's first exposure to African history is through the slave trade and their last through the American Civil Rights Movement. The problem being that if these two topics are the sole opportunities that students actually have to engage with the history of African people, then African people are presented either as victims or triumphant against oppression and therefore victims at some point. And the history of Africa itself really is not emphasised within this. And then finally, Wilkinson's work developed the link between students' positive sense of identity and the study of communities in the past that they identified with. He interviewed just under 300 Muslim boys and examined their relationship with their history curricula. He used categories of success that these students felt in response to learning certain types of history. So for example, he categorized civic success, which students felt from using historical knowledge both of Britain and the world to make sense of cultural issues. He also found from his research, actually, which is really interesting, that Muslim students wanted more, not less, British history because it allowed them to feel part of our society and to engage actively and therefore promoted civic participation. And then the second rationale for teaching a diverse past is a very different kind of argument that starts not with students' identities, but with the nature of the past and the practice of history as a discipline that seeks to uncover and explain it. According to this argument, history curricula should reflect a diverse past because the past is diverse. In other words, respecting the diversity of the past and constantly kind of questing to uncover voices hidden within that diversity is just good history. In academic history, the scope of diversity, so the scales and spaces in which diversity can be considered, so for example, local or global history, and the approaches adopted for examining perspectives are ever evolving, and the work of historians changes as a result of this. So, for example, you may have one historian who's influenced by microhistory and another by cultural history, and it's this range of approaches that really helps us to uncover previously hidden narratives. The argument that students should study a diverse past because the past is diverse should stand, I think, regardless of students' community, ethnicity, or identity. It is sometimes, nonetheless, linked to students' backgrounds, but in a converse way to that of the first rationale, namely the argument that actually all students need to learn about people who are very different from themselves. So I think you'll all agree that students need to learn about communities that feel far from their own ancestry, and students need to learn about matters of race, ethnicity, and culture, or religion that broaden their experience rather than mirror their experience. For example, one might argue that students from largely white backgrounds need more, not less, study of diversity in order to broaden their interests, understandings, and respect for difference in modern societies. When Hibbert and Patel used Yasmin Khan, who's a historian, used her scholarship, which sought to uncover Indian experiences of World War II, their work was underpinned by the rationale that a history curriculum should do just this. It should broaden students' horizons. Hibbert and Patel sought to show the global dimensions of World War II and the role that BAME participation played within it. And they thought that if students developed appreciation of a diverse past, they would be equipped with the necessary substantive and disciplinary grounding to make sense of diverse narratives. And in turn, this would allow them to develop new historical perspectives that would actually develop their understanding of diversity in the past, and it might kind of present challenges to narratives that concealed certain voices in the past. It is important to note, particularly I think in the current climate, that this type of thinking is not new. History teachers have long used this kind of rationale for a diverse curriculum. So, for example, in 2003, Kinloch saw his as Nicholas Kinloch saw his teaching of Aztec poetry as a way of, as he coined it, confounding expectations. He argued that all students should encounter difference in order to fill the gaps, and that diverse materials should be used to subvert students' preconceptions. And it's interesting to note that he was teaching at the time in Cambridgeshire, and a lot of his students were white, so he used this material specifically to do these things that are described here. Mohammed and Whitburn, and if you haven't seen this book, I absolutely recommend you getting it. It's I think it's essential to any department that are planning curricular change at the moment. They write of seeking to interrupt the psyche of students in the classroom. They, and in later work with Michelle Hussain, emphasise the need for curricular content that forces students to consider issues of justice, and they relate this to the disciplinary rationales for teaching the subject. They argue that a curriculum which embraces a diverse past helps to build respect for otherness. I've just had a question. Can I share the research? Yep, I've got loads of references for you at the end, and I have PDFs of everything, so I can put all of that into the Google Drive link that you'll all be sent after the session, not a problem. So the concern for all students to study a diverse past and to use their thinking to correct misconceptions is also something that history teachers all over the world embrace. And Barton and Levstick, for example, walk a bit of a tightrope between fostering historical thinking as defined by the discipline of history, and then balancing this against consideration, which is actually much more related to moral reasoning and action. So they relate historical understanding to civic engagement and actually argue that study of the past should provide a social education which prepares students for participation in a pluralist democracy. Their ultimate concern, therefore, is how history can actually help citizens to engage in collaboration towards the common good. And that's probably something that you've discussed within your history departments, what's the purpose of your curriculum? And it may well be that you're kind of more at one of these two ends, but there is a lot of debate around where we should stand on this kind of continuum. So on first reading, there is kind of clear tension between these two rationales. So the logical conclusion of teaching students more about communities they identify with would see students from a particular community only studying the history of those very similar to them. Clearly, this isn't good history because of how narrow the approach would be, but it would also be of kind of questionable value for the broader civic and moral purposes of a history education, such as enabling students to understand difference and have respect for others that are different from themselves, and then to build their historical perspective and incorporate into their historical thinking a real range of past perspectives and agencies. However, they're not incompatible at all, and I think it's important to note that. So a history curriculum that really attempts to address the rich range of lived experience, perspective, and agency in the past across diverse temporal and geographical scales is one where all students would see themselves at some point. So our department's starting point really was to recognise the relationship between these two rationales. Students should be able to see themselves in the curriculum, but at the same time, they should also be able to build their knowledge and understanding of a diverse past that hopefully takes them into the unfamiliar. And whereas we knew that we needed to do more as a department to ensure that all students felt included, at the same time, we knew it would be anti-educational to make students' own ethnicity and identity the main reason or the main purpose for study, because our job as history teachers is to broaden minds. We were interested too that the possible tension between these two rationales is not something that actually concerns the history teaching community. So I'd just like to draw on Jamie Byram. He wrote in a kind of curriculum addition to teaching history a few years back after the release of the 2013 curriculum, that a broad curriculum can actually develop students' historical perspective, and developing historical perspective allows students to make sense of their world and their place in it. So that really marries these two rationales. And then the second thing that I'm going to consider is what all of this actually looks like in practice. So basically, how do you teach a diverse past in the classroom? And we'll be looking at two different approaches. So the first method for doing this is to actually just teach British history in a much more diverse way. So many of you will recognise this book. I do believe that Starkey made reference to Kaufman in a rather infamous interview yesterday. So I'm looking forward to hearing her response on that. But her Black Tudors presents a fresh framework for engaging with a very well-trodden period of history. So she's adding complexity and diversity to British history. And her work and that of others such as Whitburn and Justice for History call for complexity and depth within these existing narratives. So in other words, we should break up dominant stock narratives about Britain and challenge assumptions about the past, and in doing so, facilitate the generation of a more nuanced historical narrative. As Kaufman argued, the physical presence of Africans in England literally brings home the reality of the country's growing contact with the wider world. And similarly, Whitburn and Yumo, in a teaching history article, have warned against limiting the study of the African diaspora in English schools to the Atlantic slave trade, as this fails to fully represent Black lives in England. So by adding complexity to existing narratives in the classroom, the diverse past can be acknowledged in a meaningful way without just clumsily being bolted on to the existing curriculum. And then the second way of actually teaching a diverse past has been essentially the building of a world panoptic, so having a worldwide view of history. And this has often been motivated by the desire to encourage the study of civilizations in their own right, rather than add-ons or precursors to empire. So this wouldn't follow Kaufman's approach, whereby British history is kind of unpicked and narratives are nuanced. You would actually teach other civilizations in their own right. And again, this has a long tradition. So in England's 91 National Curriculum for History, world history units were required. So for example, Islamic civilizations, Imperial China, and Mughal India were listed. But this approach, for many different reasons, which I won't go into now, didn't gain much widespread traction. And it is important to note that actually this didn't come out of the blue. The 91 curriculum drew on historical and practitioner scholarship from the 70s and 80s. I've already talked about Kinloch. So in 2003, he argued that using Aztec poems and songs to examine civilizations and empires of the Americans was a better way to address diversity than to add diversity to the existing narrative told by the curriculum. And in the same year, Walsh's Empires and Citizens textbook went much further than other textbooks that were about world civilizations in the 90s. So he basically devoted substantial attention to medieval African kingdoms within a broader Key Stage 3 curriculum. However, again, this book wasn't widely adopted. This trend has developed in more recent years. So Whitburn and Mohammed, again, doing justice to history, and many communities of history teachers that have been influenced by their work have called for us to move away from introducing African history with a sense of victimhood or Western dominance, and to have explicit units of study that are about different parts of African history within our curriculum. And then more recently, I'm sure that many of you have seen the Meanwhile Elsewhere project that has been pioneered by Bailey Watson and Kennett. And Will and Rich basically have called for a kind of a sustained comparative approach to combat Eurocentrism by allowing students to take a sideways glance at concurrent history in the classroom. Perhaps the most radical interpretation of looking at history from a world panoptic can be found in the academic discipline of world history itself. And this has largely come out of the US. So in the US, in school, well, some schools, American and world history are traditionally taught as separate subjects. Dunn has written about two arenas of world history, and his Arena A, as he terms it, is filled with scholars and teachers for whom the primary field is the human species in the planet as a whole. So pretty vast. For this group, studies of individual cultures and even the concept of teaching civilizations doesn't go far enough. And they actually call for students to be able to learn about a unified history of mankind. But this approach has yet to bear much influence on schools in England. There's somebody else, Pat Manning, who's a world historian, who really argues for us to kind of stress connections between communities, and that's very much in this same vein. So both the attempt to show greater diversity and complexity within British history and the attempt to teach world history of whatever kind share an important characteristic, and that is the avoidance of tokenism, so avoiding bolting on diversity to the curriculum. Hibbert and Patel called for integration of alternative narratives by cautioning against this bolting on. And Dennis, in a teaching history article, argued for the history curriculum to show how Britain's history is global, and to kind of stress that throughout the curriculum. And these two curriculum emphases are therefore not only complementary, but also mutually strengthening. So a focus on diversity in Britain should naturally link with a focus on world history through the connections that exist. And many argue that more emphasis on connection is vital if we are to successfully challenge exclusionary ethnocentric narratives of nation building in Britain. So finally, moving on to the impetus for our department's reform. Obviously, all of that kind of featured into our thinking. But our kind of the first real impetus for us to actually do something about all of this was our growing subject knowledge. So I'd recently attended, it was a 2017 SHP project, and conference, sorry, the summer conference. And at the conference, Toby Green, you can see one of his books here. He's a fantastic historian who looks at West African history. And Mary Jane Aladren, who set up a cultural exchange program called World of Wonderful, did a joint keynote, and they really called for us as teachers to refocus our history curricula to address the roles of West Africans in shaping global histories. And Toby Green at the same time had done a lot of work with OCR, who had created an A-level on this topic matter. And this really made us consider the ways in which students learnt about non-British history in our curriculum throughout Key Stage 3. So after considering this, we quickly then began to identify some potential problems, and these problems were pretty huge regarding the treatment of diversity within our Key Stage 3 history curriculum. So first, we did have distinct inquiries about other civilizations in Year 7, but these civilizations weren't picked up elsewhere in the curriculum. So thinking about what Hibbett and Patel argue, they say that the value of doing diversity is only really borne out when students are exposed to case studies across Key Stage 3, because anything else, as they termed it, is, as I've said, bolting on diversity to the study of history. And it doesn't, in students' heads, it's recognised as a bolting onto the curriculum and doesn't really feature in their kind of narrative of the curriculum as a whole. Secondly, students' study of the Incas in Year 7 presumed their status as victims with the particular inquiry that we got them to engage with. And Islam was part of a causal explanation for religious conflict. It was looked at as part of the Crusades, and the Incas and Islam weren't then really addressed elsewhere. So we were thinking, actually, this is building a very negative perception that students may have for different cultures. Third, individual teachers incorporated diversity, but this was largely left down to teacher preference. And I was really concerned, therefore, that students weren't picking up a consistent curricular narrative, and it was kind of dependent on which teacher you had. And then finally, slavery in Year 8 was our students' first explicit opportunity to learn about the history of African Caribbean peoples. So the second impetus was our student body. I'll return to this image in a couple of slides' time. 1/3 of our students are from ethnic minority backgrounds, and we wanted our students' voices, especially concerning matters of identity and perceptions of heritage, to inform our curriculum reform. We wanted to hear from our students firsthand as to whether they could see themselves in the curriculum, and at the same time we wanted to hear students' assumptions and reflections on what a narrative that embraces connectedness might actually look like. So we were determined not just to engage in this curriculum review from our departmental perspective, but also to factor student voices into that curriculum review. So we hoped that the project would encourage an explicit interaction between our students and our department's historical framework. And in this sense, we were blending both of the rationales for teaching a diverse past. So as part of the project, what we decided to do, and I'll go into this in a little bit more detail in a few moments, is to teach them some new history, which was African history, as you can see by the second box here, fairly intensively. And we went for the second approach to teaching a diverse past, which was essentially world history. So just to begin with, why Africa? Africa, to me, made sense as a choice because students had encountered it through our focus on the British Empire, and therefore we thought that greater, less Brit-centric knowledge of Africa would allow them to critique our existing curriculum. And we had a further rationale. We'd become pretty reflective about our own perspectives on African history from attending that SHP conference. And I was slightly embarrassed. So we had a mention of Timbuktu, which is why I started with that in this session. I was slightly embarrassed at my own ignorance of Timbuktu prior to the project. British documented perceptions present Timbuktu as the stuff of fable. So the Oxford English Dictionary, one of the definitions for Timbuktu is the most distant place imaginable. And while we hadn't used these depictions of Timbuktu in our own teaching, we were concerned that we'd failed to study this city properly in its own right. And the story of Timbuktu deserves our attention. So this is one of the reasons why we chose to tackle the Mali Empire on this day with students. So in the 1320s, it was transformed into a city of scholars, and it housed academics from Africa, Europe, and Asia. And it was also home to one of the world's most important universities, which I think Erin picked out at the start of the session, which contains 1 million manuscripts. Roughly 70,000 of those exist there today, but lots have had to have been relocated recently due to civil unrest in Mali. It had a unique style of government, which I found really interesting, whereby decision-making was rooted in the hands of scholars. And the fact that Timbuktu as a city was ruled in this way, yet was able to thrive within the Mali Empire under Musa I of Mali, who ruled as an autocrat, reveals so much, I think, about power and medieval democracy and the significance of learning and culture. And under Musa I, Timbuktu's physical location, which is a literal crossroads between Saharan and sub-Saharan Africa, made it an epicenter of medieval trade. And this saw the Mali Empire becoming rich beyond belief. So Timbuktu presented the ideal introduction, as we wanted to give our students the opportunity to see how greater knowledge of West African civilizations could disrupt and provide alternative, non-Eurocentric perspectives on the history we had already taught them. So the first activity in the day saw students use a map of the world, which you've seen already, to identify countries to which they felt most connected. So you can see the map here, and you can probably just about make out all of the dots that show where students placed these kind of connections. So the coverage is pretty spectacular. The majority of students plotted their descendancy, so we left it quite open with regards to how they wanted to plot these connections, which we thought was an important way of addressing diversity. We didn't want to suggest that diversity is purely defined by descendancy or heritage, for example. But as I say, a lot did plot with regards to descendancy, so where they themselves or their family members had come from. But that actually opened up really interesting conversations about the diversity of our school community, which enabled us to stress the need for breadth across our history curriculum. And we hoped that this would mitigate students' outcome activities, their curriculum review, being informed purely by their own descendancy. Then the purpose of the day was outlined to students. So we asked them to keep these two questions: what should we study, and would we change our curriculum offer, in mind throughout the day. And we also gave them a Key Stage 3 curriculum map and got them to kind of annotate that throughout the day to record their thoughts as they went. And then students listened to the lectures that I've mentioned, and these were focused on the Mali and Aksumite empires. And what we also did within that, we did take a kind of meanwhile elsewhere approach and signalled at which point students had studied something that was happening concurrently in the West. So we invited Mary Jane Aladren, who had spoken at SHP, to deliver the lectures, and then these were interspersed with practical activities that were led by myself and Eliza West, who was a teacher at our school. And this model, and specifically the specialist input, was designed to allow us to highlight to the students that there is content beyond which teachers have selected. So we thought that was an important thing to acknowledge as they engaged with curriculum review. And then the second part of the day really saw students working in groups to review their Key Stage 3 curriculum. So I want to be clear that the outcome from the students wasn't our curriculum rewrite. What we wanted the students to do was to reflect on the quality of the curriculum since the start of Year 7, and then consider what would excite them in the remainder of the Key Stage 3 curriculum. And picking Year 8 students at a point at which they had studied the Crusades, the Incas, and the slave trade in our existing curriculum allowed them to have a really kind of informed perspective on our curriculum. I'll go through these next couple of bits quite quickly, and please obviously feel free to refer back to this in the recording. But these are a couple of things that we gave to students to structure their curriculum review. So the first one I've mentioned already, questions that they may want to ask of our existing curriculum, and then they had their curriculum map to support that discussion, and then a few questions that would guide their discussions, and as I say, they were in groups to do this. And then we also said you may want to look at these, but you may choose to just look at the first bank of resources. So first was the non-statutory Key Stage 3 curriculum guidance from 2013, and the second was an article that discussed where the author thought a history curriculum in a different country had gone wrong, and that was basically down to content choice. And we thought that would really inform their view about why curriculum construction is such a contentious issue. So before they started writing, they were asked to come up with criteria that would govern their curriculum reviews. And we were really encouraged by their thoughtful responses to the importance of African history, both as part of history that does justice to diverse civilizations, and as material that could help some students to connect with regards to their particular identities. And clearly, some of the criteria reflect both of the rationales that I discussed at the start for studying a diverse past, and both of the methods for practical application. So we were encouraged that it was possible to achieve a blend of these rationales and a blend of these methods. You can see here some excerpts from students' curriculum reviews. So some of this does show a bit of a wish list of substantive content to be covered, and then a couple of others just think adding more countries equals more diversity. But there's actually within some of these points some really interesting and important reflections. So firstly, some comments demonstrate that students quite emphatically had identified specific parts of our curriculum that they thought eroded their ability to engage with diversity in a true sense and build a diverse appreciation for the past. There was also a clear indication that the majority of comments, from the majority of comments rather, that students did not wish to narrow their history curriculum. So it was only specific to their own sense of heritage, which we thought was really encouraging. So they wanted more. They wanted to know what a diverse past looked like. And then a striking point arising from a number of students' reviews was that students' desire for the curriculum to present a framework that enabled them to have an appreciation and understanding of the way in which the world works today. So they wanted topic choice and focus to resonate with current issues in ways that would aid understanding of those particular issues. So just to conclude, our department found so much value in this project. It raised lots of questions. It shone a light on some serious curricular inadequacies, which I've talked through, and that really needed addressing. And I'm going to summarise our thinking into 3 main points. So firstly, student involvement and perspective are key to curriculum construction. I'm not recommending that student voice becomes a kind of tokenistic part or routine way to construct curricula. Neither that the curriculum becomes a mirror image of the classroom. Rather, we as history teachers need to carefully consider what our students will see and hear through the implied narratives that underpin our history curricula. And we also need to consider how these narratives broaden and develop students' historical perspectives. And second, our department needs to give deliberate consideration to the employment of diversity throughout the entire curriculum. It's not good enough to just bolt it on and just to think, okay, we'll do this so that we are doing diversity. Various methods have been discussed throughout this article. And whilst I'm not advocating a specific approach, I am cautioning against the coverage of other histories that as a kind of afterthought. So shoehorning diversity into an overarching narrative will do little to challenge perceptions or to keep students raising good questions about Britain's past global connections and how these are revealed and concealed by different histories. And then finally, we must consider the way in which the frameworks we supply in the classroom invite students to interact with diversity. We all have frameworks. We may not kind of introduce them to students explicitly, but a framework is essentially a tool to get students to reflect. So it may be the case that you've got a note grid. You may return to the inquiry question at the end of each lesson. You may give students a few themes to look out for. Whatever you're doing, I think we need to consider if our frameworks inspire meaningful student interaction with generalizations and hypotheses. And we also need to consider how we kind of discern and monitor shifts in students' perspectives as we work through our curriculum. So I'm sorry, I'm aware that I'm a couple of minutes over, just to talk very briefly about how we've changed our curriculum as a result. And if you do need to go, that's absolutely fine, and the recording will be sent out to you. So looking at the big picture of our Key Stage 3 curriculum, and we've got Stephen Leonard in this session today, who is the architect of a lot of this work. So thank you very much, Stephen. But our Key Stage 3 curriculum, we've basically incorporated a broad range of histories of different societies, civilizations and culture to diversify British history. So for example, in Year 7, Britain's connectedness to the rest of the world is stressed, and at relevant points, change in Britain is situated within change on a global scale. So, for example, we highlight the emergence of Black Romans in England who are of high status. And then when we look at the Normans, we focus on England being caught between the crosshairs of different international powers. And we also explore patterns of migration with different peoples, for example, Anglo-Saxons, Normans, and the Vikings. And we're beginning to work in Kaufman's resources on the Black Tudors. Secondly, our Key Stage 3 curriculum considers flashpoints, essentially points in the lessons at which we make explicit references to global events that have changed the way in which England and later Britain was ruled, or their place in Europe and the wider world. This goes against the view proposed by, I guess, traditional history curricula that England and its rulers acted as the only agent of change, as even if this is not explicitly suggested to our students, it could be the message that they take away from an Anglo-centric curriculum. And some of the flashpoints that we look at include the fall of Rome, Viking migration, the Mongol invasion, which is linked to our Black Death inquiry, the Crusades, Renaissance, and Reformation. And then historical scholarship is used to the same effect. So we use quite a bit of Frankopan's Silk Roads. In that book, he provided a new narrative, a new framework with which we might scaffold students' understanding of the past by calling for us to kind of reorientate our Western-centric focus. And then thought has also been given to the narrative told by our Key Stage 3 curriculum and how this develops and broadens students' perspectives. So the Year 8 curriculum, for example, is focused around the theme of revolution, which we use as a lens to consider how the nature of power and authority compares in different countries. So we compare the North Americas, Latin America, France, the Mughals, the Qing dynasty, and the Ottomans within this. And then when appropriate, interactions between different countries are discussed, and how revolution differed in different settings and across different time periods is considered to build a kind of period and context-specific understanding of revolution. And we hope that this informed sense of historical context allows our students to develop and add breadth to their historical perspective. And then finally, we've reassessed the way in which we use historians' interpretations throughout Key Stage 3 to ensure that we have encouraged and incorporated a range of perspectives. So, for example, when we look at the White Lotus Rebellion or the Janissary Revolt, we compare pre-colonial, colonial, nationalist and revisionist interpretations of their significance. And we begin to introduce students to terms like revisionism, which allows us to unpick the drivers behind revising history, and by inviting students to question how history is constructed, we think in turn that will develop their historical perspectives. So I've said all of that very quickly. It's summarized on a slide for you. There's loads of amazing stuff on Twitter at the moment. There's loads of people that are working on this. So here are some examples, but please do get engaged and think carefully, and don't rush into just adding diversity into your curricula. And if you do want to pick up on anything that I've referenced today, all of the references that I've talked about in this talk are here. And as I said, I'll put all of the PDFs related to these that I have into a Dropbox for you. Thanks so much for your attendance today. Really appreciate you joining us.